Hello, Americans. I'm Kent McNall, and it's Constitution time for this Wednesday, October 21st, 2020, T minus 13 days before the election. I'm very excited today to have our first guest panel joining us, and we have a really interesting topic, which is the Electoral College. As I've talked before about this topic on the show, I mentioned that you and I don't actually vote for the president. Our votes go to nominate or elect electors who will actually do the electing of the president. And it's a really interesting topic with a lot of great history. And we've got some folks with us this evening that are going to help us talk about that. So without further ado, let me get everybody on the screen here. Hello, gentlemen. Um, Great to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to ask each of you to just do a quick introduction of yourself. And Bob, why don't we start with you?
My name is Bob Newton, and I am retired. Um, I have two children and two stepchildren, and they're all grown up. And Gail and I are enjoying a fine retirement.
Wonderful. Stephen.
Hi, I'm Steven Steck. I am the CTO at a small startup in Seattle. I've known Ken for 7-ish years now. Got two kids, and yeah, happy to be here.
Great to have you, Stephen. Sam?
Hey, I'm Sam Demmeling. I've known Kent for 20 plus years at this point. They've been very exciting times. I'm the proud father of five, and uh, excited to be here as well. Like where we mix here in government. I think it should be smaller.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sam. I know we're going to every once in a while have some glitches with our broadcast this evening. Even CNN and Fox do from time to time, so we're probably not going to be immune to that. So, to kick us off here this evening, I think a great place to start is the beginning of the electoral system, and particularly um, what were the ideas of its original conception? And Bob, I thought you might be able to kick us off with that.
Sure, glad to, Kent. The Electoral College was embedded in the Constitution, Article 2, by the founders. Um, we called for ended up with a strange mix of things in the election of 1800 with a tie, and they figured that they needed to do something to change that. So they amended the Constitution to have each electoral voter um, vote only once. That seemed to solve the problem. The basic concept behind the whole electoral college was based around the republic form of government, as opposed to having a direct electorate who elected laws directly. We have our Congress, we have our Senate, and those people make the laws. We do not vote directly to make the laws in the country, and hence we're a republic. The concept was the same with the Electoral College. You would vote for men by quality, who would then vote to elect the President of the United States. That was the concept. It's obviously changed much since then because of the political parties, of the way the political parties work. But there is carryover from the real fears that were existing at that time. Many of the founders, of course, were farmers. Washington, Jefferson, et cetera, all from Virginia. And their concern was a tyranny of the majority. In other words, they were concerned that the larger population, if there was a direct election of the president, would elect a president who would inhibit their rights because they came from smaller states and they came from less populous states. I believe that that applies still somewhat today in the sense that we could, if there was a direct election of the president, we could see many of the larger population areas, for example, New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, electing the president with an overwhelming vote of those people. That would concern, naturally, some of the smaller states and some of the people in the smaller states. So that's the basic background of where it came from and what's happened with it.
Bob, thank you. That was a great kickoff there. Just FYI, guys, we have some extra noise coming in. I'm not positive where from. Could be fiddle around. I'm not sure. Or just Zoom noises. Sam, let me ask you to pick it up from there because you had some really interesting observations when we talked earlier today about those beginnings and some of the interesting facts around that.
Yeah, thanks, Kent. And I love this topic. And where I started out with the Electoral College was pretty much a preconception that Bob lifted there or listed there, which was it was about the tyranny of the majority. That was one of the main reasons it existed. But again, that's only a soundbite. So the fact that you asked this question to have me on the show has caused me to go out and do research and learn a little bit more about our history that I did not know before. And one of the more interesting things to take in consideration was the technology of the time is one of the big reasons it existed. Mass media did not exist back when the Republic was formed. Other things did not exist as well. Things like cars. We had to travel by horses back then. Even the postal system, I'm not even sure was quite created in the late 1700s at that point. So there was a lot of differences going on. And one of the big things the Electoral College allowed folks to do was to gather everybody in a singular place and really account for some of the problems that might happen when technology wasn't available. Other interesting things I learned along the way was that it was a compromise. The Electoral College was one of the main reasons was tyranny of the majority, but there were a lot of different proposals that were put in place until they came up with a compromise solution overall, including relying on the popular vote. One of the scary things about what our founding fathers thought about the popular vote was actually that most people would be ignorant of who to elect, that they could not be well informed at that point. So that was a reason. So there was that thought. But I don't think it was a thought of ignorance as an unintelligent. I think they were just thinking there was no way to get the information out there. There was no such thing as mass media back then. So how was the general population going to be well informed? Other things that could happen along the way that they were worried about were things like having buy-in from the rest of the country. The founding fathers were worried that if you did popular votes, you're going to recognize names from your own area at that time, much more likely than you would anybody else. And the thought was you could not govern effectively if you didn't have if you were only popular in one area, but everybody else just kind of thought, oh, that's the guy from the south or that's the guy from the north kind of scenario was another interesting one as well. And on the flip side of the world, another thing they had offered up before they came up with the compromise were things like the Congress actually putting the president in power. But if you allow the Congress to put him in power, then they thought there might be too much. Hey, the president's just kind of a puppet of the Congress. If you're really doing checks and balances, which was super important to them, that you would kind of not have some of those checks and balances in place because of who put the president in place. And then finally, what I was going to go with was a couple cool things went along the way as well. It really changed radically by the 12th Amendment and how the Electoral College was run. There's been times where it's not, I think there were 4 times in history, and I think other folks that more, where it wasn't decided by the popular vote, but it was actually decided by the Electoral College. But in the early days, one of my favorite stories from Electoral College was Jefferson and Burr. Early on, there wasn't a presidential and vice presidential ticket. You weren't running 2 people together. Instead, what would happen is everybody would run, and first and second place would be president and vice president, respectively, which means you could definitely get 2 different parties being president and vice president. And one time with Jefferson and Burr, they were of the same party. They were kind of trying to be president and vice president, respectively. But what happened is they crushed their opponents, but their opponents had enough folks in the Congress that they were meddling with, or sorry, they got enough going on in the Electoral College that they were able to meddle with it, and they almost got Burr elected president, which would have been a nice kind of snub in the face for some of the things that were going on in the early days. So politics has been around forever, and petty grievances have always been a part of our system. So it was fun to even see in history that, hey, there's nothing new under the sun. We were doing dirty things even back in the early days.
Yeah, there's nothing new about politics. So, Stephen, can you bring us up to more current times a little bit by talking, starting the conversation about how the Electoral College works today? How many electors are there? Why are there many? What do they actually do?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, today we've got 538 electors electing the president, and you need 270 to win. Obviously, a lot has been talked about with the news media about getting to that 270 number and everything. But when you vote for your candidate, be it Trump or Biden or third party or whatever, you're telling your state not to vote for that candidate. You're telling them to assign specific electors who are pledged to that candidate. And those electors all get together, and in December they cast their votes for the next president of the United States. Obviously, as we saw last time in 2016, there were 13 what we call faithless electors, where they cast a vote differently than their state asked them to. 3 of them were invalidated based on state laws, but 10 of them actually went through and the votes were counted as different. But that is kind of how it happens today. Is the states each send a fixed number of electors based on their Senate and Congress seats. So when we do apportionment, so upcoming census will affect the 2024 election, as well as the 2022 election, but the 2024 presidential election will actually have a different ratio per state of electors. So California is supposed to lose 1, Texas is supposed to gain 3, is the current estimates. We obviously won't know the final numbers until the census is validated by the House.
So, Stephen, these faithless electors that we had in the last election, number one, where are they doing their time? And number 2, did that change the result of the election?
So faithless electors have never changed the result of any election. As far as I know, I did some cursory research and I couldn't find any instance where faithless electors had changed the result of the election. In 33 states, there are laws against faithless electors. So there's an explicit law saying you have to vote how the popular vote of your state plays out, plus DC. 14 of those states will actually cancel the vote. So if you are a faithless elector in one of those 14 states and you go and you vote for somebody else, your vote actually gets canceled and they replace you with somebody who will vote. And I believe it can cancel basically an unlimited number of times 5 states out of the 33 plus DC have penalties, and those penalties can range anywhere from a $500 fine to 36 months in jail, although I don't actually think anyone has been sent to jail for being a faithless elector in modern history. Yeah.
So, the faithless elector, because that's a really interesting topic, they're being faithless to the people that appointed them to be an elector, which is who?
That would be the Congress of each state, or the legislator of each state. So the legislators send specific electors from the party, and they'll either pick, all right, well, we're going to send all of the electors from the Democrat Party or all of the electors from the Republican Party, and how the specific people who are electors is chosen is kind of based on each party. Each party does it slightly differently.
Now, I understand that all states are represented by electors, and also Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, but that our territories, including Guam and I believe even Puerto Rico, are not represented by electors. Does that mean that those folks do not have a say in the election?
Correct. Yeah, so there are 3.5 million people in territories, 3.1 being in Puerto Rico, that get no say in who our next president would be. And to put that in perspective, that would make them it's either the 21st or the 22nd largest state, and as many as like about the same number as the bottom 5 states combined in terms of population get absolutely no say as to who the next president will be.
So I want to open this up to everybody, and there's a lot of interesting subtopics to talk about here, and I want to get to those as well. But one of the things I want to do is really ask the question, are there still merits to this system? Does it still do something good and useful for us in the modern context where we do have a very well-informed electorate and we don't have to ride a horse to Washington, D.C., etc.? Thoughts?
Yeah, I can.
Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, I'll jump in on that one first. And I think to really determine whether we should be still doing it by electoral college, it's what still applies today versus what applied in history, I think is a big consideration here. Some of the reasons we were talking about earlier that they had put it in place were technology reasons that don't exist today. I don't think we have to worry about the population not knowing who's our president at this point. I think it's widespread knowledge, and I think there's many resources we have to educate folks on it. I think it comes down to actually that original soundbite, the one that Bob mentioned earlier, that is probably the most important one, at least in my mind, as far as is it a real reason, the tyranny of the majority. One of the cool things that the founders did in America, in my opinion, is they did give the majority a possibility to rule, but they always had minority interests in mind. Whoever was not in power, the majority just couldn't kind of stomp all over them. They realized that urban centers would always be ahead of rural areas as far as what the politics were, what the policies were, what people needed. So they had to try to find a way to make sure that both groups were included, that you couldn't go too fast, I think was the biggest thing they were looking for. You see this in the Congress and the Senate, where Congress is totally by the House of Representatives, that it is totally done by population, where Senate is two for everyone. It's a really interesting split. So it's a combination of popular rights versus, okay, every state has their differences, and we want to account for some of the smaller states to make sure they don't get overrun. I think that was a cool thing our founding fathers did in the Electoral College hybrid. It's what Steck mentioned earlier. It's the population plus 2, every senator that you have. You see politics running all around trying to manipulate those numbers overall. That's one thing we got to deal with. But I think from a tyranny of majority perspective, I kind of like it. I don't know if
I
the
like it
presidency.
from the Senate standpoint, because I think that's where it really comes into. I'm not sure how much that weighs in on the electoral side, but Bob, can you pick it up from there?
Well, I tend to agree with Sam. I think it does apply. When I think about the tyranny of the majority in terms of the electoral college or the election of the president, I think of it in terms of, quite frankly, extreme, large, liberal population areas. We have a number of those. Certainly Los Angeles, to some extent, New York to a greater extent, Chicago to a great extent, Atlanta to a great extent, extremely large populations of liberal majorities. If those people were to vote and we were to elect the president based upon simply that kind of majority, I think there is an issue of the tyranny of majority. I think that that we could create some problems for the small farmer, for the small businessman, for people who don't necessarily agree with the policies that are good for those quite liberal places.
Because those geographies are few, even though they're very, very highly populated. So you're saying that having those few very large majorities always calling the shots is not fair to the rest of the country, which is a much, much larger physical space.
Correct.
Stephen, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, so I've got kind of 2 points there. So I could see how that's a nice idea in principle from the point of a rural person in, say, Idaho or even Washington State. But unfortunately, because of those large population centers and the fact that states are winner take all, so it doesn't matter that 32% of California in 2016 voted for Trump or 43% of Texas voted for Clinton. All of Texas's electoral college votes went to Trump, and all of California's went to Clinton. So because of that kind of winner take all way that things are done, it really boils down to 6 to 12 states. So this 2020 election, most of the news reports I've seen say it boils down to 6 or 7 states. In 2016, 2/3 of all of the events happened in 6 states, and 94% happened in 12. So you really end up with the candidates voting, spending a lot of time and a lot of things to a handful of swing states, and not all of them are the kind of small rural states. I mean, you've got Florida in there. That's a very large state with a lot of population, but because it's a very mixed state in terms of how it's going to swing, it gets a lot of attention.
Stephen, you had written out a couple of ideas that you wanted to talk about, and one I kind of want to ask you about. I'm not going to remember all the initials. NV, I can't remember.
The NPVIC,
There you
the
go.
National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. So
can you talk about that idea?
yeah, so basically it's a collection of states. I believe we're at 11 right now. It's a pretty small number right now, of states that have gotten together and said, all right, well, we as a state don't really like the Electoral College, so but we can't get a constitutional amendment to get rid of it. So instead, the plan is when we hit 270 electoral votes in states that agree with us, we will pledge all of our votes to whoever wins the national popular vote instead of pledging them to the vote that our state gave. So currently we're at 196 electoral votes that have enacted, 64 are pending. So we've still got a handful to go before that could be a reality. And even then, it will be challenged in the Supreme Court because of the compact clause of the Constitution that says Congress needs to approve any compacts, as well as I'm sure there will be tons of other challenges from both sides. I mean, there are many many Democrats and Republicans that have been very vocally supportive of the Electoral College.
Thoughts on that, Sam or Bob?
I definitely like some of Stephen's points there. And if you get down to it in states' rights overall, even though I may not be in favor of swinging on the popular vote, I think it's well within the states. I'd approve of the states having the power to make some of those decisions overall. Just like originally, back when it was first started, the states were choosing who their electorals were, and they were making the decisions back then. Another interesting thought that cropped up to me, Kent, while you were talking about this was the concept of fairness in all this. It's a really interesting one. What is fair? And I'm not necessarily sure this is geared towards what is fair, which you could really make a good case is the popular vote here. I think it's geared towards making sure the minority feels heard because no government can function without the consent of the minority. If the majority just wins all the time, then you get disillusioned citizens, and I think that that's a problem the founding fathers were striving to avoid. I don't think they did it to perfection, but I think that was embedded in their framework that they were trying to achieve.
Majority rule, minority veto is something that recurs in our government, in our Constitution, or at least some cases how we've implemented it. For example, the little trick that the Senate plays with the guys that talk and talk and talk and talk, or at least they used to have to. Now all they have to do is say, "I'm going to talk and talk and talk and talk and talk." I think there's a 24-hour limit. What's the word for that thing again? I should know that.
Filibuster.
Thank you.
Filibuster?
See, I told you I got three smart guys here. Bob, any other thoughts on that one?
No, I mean, I think I agree with Sam that what we're concerned about here primarily are the rights of the minority, and I guess my feeling is, or my opinion is, that the Electoral College still leans towards maintaining the rights of the minority. I think it's important. I think that as the founding fathers said, that's a critical issue. I believe that they felt that way because of where they were from, and I think that we certainly see that in terms of today's politics. I think that people in the minority would have a very difficult problem if the majority just won every time.
Some interesting analysis that I was looking at today. You know, the Electoral College brings about these extremely interesting scenarios where one pundit was saying that, well, if these states get carried by this guy and these states get carried by this guy, which is not unlikely, then Maine will decide the national election. And those kinds of scenarios are very, very interesting. Who ends up holding the bag with the power? And of course, this conversation was being directed to say somebody better spend some money there in a place that you don't normally spend money. So it does bring about some pretty interesting scenarios. Okay, so one of the reasons that I wanted to discuss this topic is because I don't recall a time in our history. Certainly, there are those times that the Electoral College has decided the presidential election. Sam mentioned 4 back in the 1800s, and in 2 of the last 3 elections. I don't recall anyone saying there was anything incorrect about that, that it was not properly done or that it was manipulated. But there have now been open discussions of what I would think of as manipulation if they occurred. State legislate state legislatures that are considering essentially, if they don't like the way the mail-in vote goes, they want to take over and send their own slate of electors, despite what the people of their state apparently voted. Now, I don't want to perpetuate any kind of conspiracy theory. To my knowledge, these have been openly discussed. But are we possibly entering an age where the electoral system has cracks in it that could be exploited? Thoughts on that?
I think that's
I
an
mean, I think
interesting question. Oh, sorry. I'll continue a little bit, Sec, then I'll go to you. But the first thought that occurs to me is Electoral College directly related to the trustworthiness of the voting system? And I would have to lean away from that. I think it is a valid conversation, but I don't know if the trustworthiness of how voting goes is directly related to the Electoral College here.
Well, I think that if you actually did have a problem with your voting, which the only real problem that anybody would care about is that more votes were cast than should have been, one way or the other. That clearly, in 48 of the 50 states, I believe, would dictate the slate of electors. So I think there's a fairly direct connection there. If there is a problem with the voting, which there never has been. So you want to amplify your answer there, Sam, or?
Yeah, so it comes down to what the solution is. Do you want to fix the voting system, or do you want to rely on the Electoral College to kind of be resilient against it? There is a point to that where maybe there's a resiliency component if you do think there's funny business going on. It's a complicated question you're presenting there. I'd like other folks to weigh in on that too.
Stephen, you had a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, there's already a few areas where the Electoral College can fall down and can end up with a vote that is not very representative. But yeah, definitely, if a state legislator were to override the vote of the people for whatever reason they decide to, that would obviously end up getting challenged in at least the state Supreme Court and potentially the actual federal Supreme Court, as to whether there's very much that can happen with that. At least in the 14 states that cancel the faithless electors, you could pretty easily make an argument that they constitute faithless electors because a lot of them, because they're not voting how the will of the people were. But it would really come down to a pretty strong court battle that would likely drag on and result in other strange scenarios happening with who ends up as interim president and acting president and that kind of thing. I mean, you can currently win the Electoral College and win the presidency with 22% of the United States voting for you. So we already have a scenario where there's ways that it can fall down. So having one more is possibly not a thing to concern too much about until it happens.
Bob, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, anything's possible, but certainly it's possible that 22% of the population could elect a president. Highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. It would not probably happen once in 1,000 years. So with regard to that particular scenario, I would say that in almost all instances in the past, we have had a fair election as a result of the results of the Electoral College. I don't think that anybody would claim that we've had an unfair election as a result of the Electoral College votes. So I think that looking at far-fetched scenarios, I just don't see it happening. I don't see a legislator or a legislature in any particular state. For example, in the state of Washington, certainly, which is highly likely to vote Democratic, and the legislature is Democratic, having an issue where they would change the elector. That's probably true in 95 to 99% of the states, where when they vote the way they vote, the legislature is composed of the same thing.
So what I'm hearing the panel say is a couple of things. Number one, that this system still has merit, even though some of it, the reasons that it was created in the first place really don't apply anymore. But important reasons that it was created in the first place still apply. And I'm also hearing them say that it has its own integrity that might not be completely separated from the popular vote, but does have the ability to stand on its own merit in addition to the popular vote. And I think I would agree that I don't think anybody challenges either the integrity of any past election or the result of the Electoral College. But what is interesting is that two of the last, of the 4 instances of the Electoral College overriding the popular vote, 2 of them have happened in the last 20 years. And so one question I had about the 13 faithless electors, if you know this, Stephen, I think that was the last election. Is that the most faithless electors that we've ever had? Is that like number 1 with a bullet, or did we have more in the past?
I don't know if that's the highest number we've had. I know it ranks reasonably high up there, but it still isn't enough to. We've never had enough to sway any kind of election.
Okay.
Can I?
Yep.
I was wondering if I could ask Stephen a follow-up question on that. Is it enough, though, where we might not have a majority in the Electoral College? And then what the heck happens if there's not a majority?
Yes. So certainly, if you, especially in an extremely close election like the one in some previous elections, and potentially the one we're coming up to, it definitely can cause a candidate to drop below that 270 mark, at which point it falls to the House and the Senate to decide who the president and vice president are. So the House would vote, each state getting 1 vote. So the representatives from that state get together and figure out how to cast their 1 vote, who the president is, and then in the Senate, all the states get. I think it's much as to whether it's 1 or 2. I don't know offhand, but and they decide who the vice president is. Of course, you still actually have a possibility for a tie there because we've got 50 states and 100 senators. If you were to have a tie in the House, but not a tie in the Senate, the vice president would end up as the acting president. If you had a tie in both, the Speaker of the House would be the acting president until either the House or the Senate can agree enough that there's 51 votes for one candidate, or 26 votes.
But I think the interesting part of what you just said is that the states all have, did you say one vote for the president?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more of those small states that don't want to get rolled by the majority than there are of the large states with the population. So that is an interesting possible result. And again, another one that I am pretty sure has never happened. But
It has happened once in 18. I was either 2476, I want to say.
That is the means that was used to select the president.
There were 3 candidates running, and none of them hit the 200. Well, hit the halfway mark at the time. So the House and Senate ended up deciding who the president and vice president were.
Wasn't that also true in 1800 when we had the tie? Wasn't that thrown to the House of Representatives? I thought the Aaron
Possibly, yeah.
Jefferson was thrown to the House as well.
So these things can happen. They have happened. Well, gentlemen, this has been a terrific conversation. Is there any other topic that any of you would like to bring up related to the Electoral College? It's a much deeper, wider subject than I ever thought, and very, very fascinating. But any of you have another one to discuss?
The last thing I would kind of want to say is that it may feel like it would be the tyranny of the majority if only the large states got to decide, but because even in the large states, they're pretty divided as well. I mean, they usually lean one way or the other, except for certain large states. And the metro areas really don't account for more than about, depending on where you draw the lines for metro area, 20 to 40% of the country. Just the fact that our presidential elections have, like, the popular vote, yes, so the popular vote in 2016 would have put Clinton in instead of Trump, but it was a pretty slim majority there, percentage-wise.
It wasn't enough. So I would also say that, oh, go ahead.
The other thing I would add is both parties and the population seem to change quite a bit over time too, and that's an added measure of resiliency, especially parties being willing to change. I mean, California produced Reagan. They were not. It's not always been one way or the other. They changed quite a bit, and in some ways they've been a bellwether of what's changing in the country, but in other ways they've not either. So it's interesting to watch. I'm always surprised by what happens.
Well, going back to the beginning, the states were extremely concerned about state rights, and much of this kind of system was a reflection of that. And I would also say that those small states, Northeast states, and many of the states, didn't lose that concern. And as we spread westward, the states got bigger and bigger and bigger until finally California, hey, we found a state way out there, but it's heaven. We better make it huge so we don't have too many other small states out on the West Coast. There's 40 million people in California. They do deserve some say. And in my opinion, California should be 3 states. So that's not likely to happen, but some of those dynamics that were there from the beginning, I think, are still there.
One
And their
other thought I had, Kent, in reading all this, I know it's a Constitution time, but the Federalist Papers, I don't think we mentioned them here at all, is a very interesting route to get more into some of the thinking behind what the founding fathers had for the Electoral College and why they were thinking the way they were thinking. So just a shout out to that. Very interesting read.
Yes, Sam, as a part of this, I read, I think it was Federalist 8, which was Hamilton's discussion of the Electoral College. It's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. And I agree. It's, you know, if you really want to understand what their thoughts were, that the Federalist Papers are certainly a great read.
Bob just said Federalist 8 was a good one maybe to start with. That's great. Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for joining us today on Constitution Time. I hope to invite you back and get a yes from time to time. Appreciate all of your input. And to our folks that watched live this evening, I also want to thank you, but we appreciate you coming and watching live or not. So watch it later, anytime you like. Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place. Take care.